Sobriety doesn't have to suck. A guide to finding happiness, excitement, and spiritual fulfillment in recovery. Introduction. One day while I was working on the manuscript for this ebook, I decided to test something out. I was in a session with a client who'd been sober for a couple months at the time. Towards the end of the session, I showed him the cover page for the ebook and I asked him to tell me what thoughts came up as he read the title, Sobriety's Not Supposed to Suck, A Guide to Finding Excitement, Renewal, and Spiritual Fulfillment in Recovery. He looked at it for a minute or two and started to laugh. Well, that's definitely how I felt the first month or two. Man, I was miserable, walking around crying about how awful everything was. Yeah, it definitely sucked. I pointed out that he had just spent the previous hour displaying an attitude that looked a lot more like the second part of the title. He was clearly happy and enthusiastic about new things in his life that are a direct result of his sobriety. And some of the things we'd been discussing during the session were specific examples of what might be identified as spiritual fulfillment or renewal. The question is, how did he go from I'm miserable and sobriety sucks to being happy and excited about recovery in just a few short months? That's what we're going to look at in this guide to finding excitement, renewal, and spiritual fulfillment in recovery. Personal transformation. The conversation I described in the introduction is pretty much the same conversation I've been having with treatment clients for over 30 years now. During my time running treatment groups, I'd frequently ask clients how they feel about being sober, opening the door for them to talk about their view of having to get sober as more of a prison sentence rather than an exciting opportunity for spiritual growth. And it's quite understandable. Here's a synopsis of the common things I hear from people who are still in the quote-unquote sobriety sucks camp. First, I have to give up something I love and makes me feel so good. Then you start telling me all these other things I have to give up. Friends who use, doing all the stuff I love doing. Damn right this sucks. Again, it's understandable that giving up something we're using to make us feel good is not going to be an attractive proposition. And it also shouldn't be overlooked that moving from sobriety sucks to being excited about recovery is a big shift, a really big shift. I'll go so far as to characterize it as a transformation. We're talking major changes here in our attitudes, our priorities, and when it comes down to it, our whole outlook on life in general. It's not uncommon to hear people who've made it to this point say things like, I feel like a new person. They're not simply staying dry by abstaining from mood-altering substances. Rather, they've experienced an entire personal transformation. They are a very different person from the one who was miserable, complaining about having to be sober, and dreading life without chemicals. Viewing this from the perspective of personal transformation, it brings us back to the question of how do we get from point A to point B? Part of the reason I regularly have this conversation about sobriety sucks with clients is to specifically point out what we're doing to help them get to point B. When I had this discussion with my client from the earlier example, we went on to talk about the work we'd been doing over the past several months. I pointed out that all the various approaches and methods I'd been employing with him were specifically designed to help him move from being miserable and hating sobriety to being excited and inspired about his recovery, which he'd been clearly displaying during our session prior to the discussion about this topic. This dynamic of personal transformation and the role this plays in successful recovery has been the foundation of my work for over 30 years now. And I can say I've watched hundreds of clients make the transition from this sucks to excited and fulfilled. So let's dive in and I'll provide a brief outline of some underlying principles you can use to create a process for yourself that opens the door to your own personal transformation. Inside job. As you may have already guessed, this guide to finding excitement, renewal, and spiritual fulfillment and recovery isn't going to be about the 10 best recipes for jaw-dropping mocktails or a guide to the best sober karaoke bars in your area. Sorry, if that's what you're looking for, I'm sure there's plenty of information you can find on the internet. As mentioned in the previous section, one of the biggest reasons people struggle with sobriety has to do with how we feel. You're making me give up the one thing that makes me feel good. So it only makes sense that we start there in looking for a solution to changing our attitude about sobriety. The following is an excerpt from a workbook I wrote that I've been using in my work with treatment clients for over 20 years now. It lays the groundwork for addressing the dynamic of using drugs or alcohol to change how we feel. Andrew Weil says in his book, The Natural Mind, that man has an innate desire to alter consciousness. He describes a progression of learned behaviors, from spinning around in circles when we're young to make ourselves dizzy, to learning about sex, alcohol, drugs, and other mood-altering activities that become available to us as we grow older. Meditation and other spiritual practices are identified as perhaps the purest and most effective means of achieving this desired effect. His point is that this follows a progression in which the results are directly related to the knowledge of and the amount of effort and discipline put into the means by which we choose to satisfy this desire. It goes on to point out that the introduction of meditation and other spiritual practices to the list brings up an important point about where we're looking as far as the source for changing how we feel. To put it succinctly, are we going outside of ourselves to change how we feel, or are we looking within? I can provide a pretty darn good example of how this dynamic works and the implication this can hold for achieving a rewarding experience in recovery. For years, I ran treatment groups with adolescents and young adults, and I was sort of known as the guy who did the weird spiritual stuff with the drums and music. A standard part of our groups was to begin with some form of drumming or meditation activity, complete with candles, incense, and other forms of ritual. I'd frequently have the group lay flat on their backs in a circle, and I would use a drum to facilitate some form of meditation or guided imagery with the group. Sometimes I'd drum directly over them to allow them to really experience the vibrations of the drum. Over the years, I got accustomed to one particular scenario that would occur pretty regularly when we do these type of meditations. The new person in the group, perhaps only a few days clean, experiencing this for the first time, would come out of one of these meditations and almost predictably would say something like, "That was awesome. It's like I felt like I was high, only it was different. It was like pure." I would hear that response time and time again. It was like I was high, only it was pure. And these clients had no idea about any of the talk we were about to get into regarding what it is that we're looking for through our drug use, and that there might be other ways to achieve this. This illuminates a dichotomy of whether we're looking outside or going within to change how we feel, or, as Andrew Weil indicates, to satisfy a desire to alter our consciousness. The consistent, unprompted response of, "It was like being high, only it was pure," speaks volumes and supports the suggestion that meditation and spiritual practices are identified as the purest and most effective means of achieving the desired effect. My purpose here is not to suggest that drumming or meditation is the only solution to overcoming addiction. This simply provides one example that points to the more important concept of looking outside ourselves for something that's supposed to come from within. Learning to feel good from inside ourselves is ultimately going to be the strongest anti-drug we can find. If I really like how I feel from inside, why would I want to change how I feel? Spiritual or religious? The previous section refers to meditation or spiritual practices as perhaps the purest way to satisfy our innate tendency to want to alter our consciousness or change how we feel. Introducing the word spiritual into the conversation about recovery can become a lightning rod for opinions and attitudes, and in many cases it becomes an unfortunate barrier to achieving successful recovery. However, a lot of the problems related to this whole idea of spirituality and recovery can be avoided with a little attention to unpacking exactly what is meant and not meant when terms like spiritual experience or higher power are thrown around. To begin this discussion on spirituality and recovery, I need to share a little of my personal story with you, as it's directly related to everything we're going to be talking about for the rest of this book. Relapsed drug counselor. In 1988, I suffered a relapse into my own addiction and ended up back in rehab, this time as a relapsed drug counselor. That was not a fun experience. But as painful as that time was for me, it was an experience that changed my life and got me started on my own journey of personal transformation. In short, I'll say that the big thing that happened for me during that time in treatment was I got lit up spiritually. That's where I was introduced to some non-traditional spiritual practices, which included the kind of drumming and meditation activities I just described in my own work with my treatment clients. This process of reestablishing my own recovery caused me to recognize things that had been previously missing in my recovery. And the biggest thing was the spirituality piece. I became hungry to grow spiritually while remaining steadfastly committed to work in my recovery program. Spiritual experience. Two statements I came across during that time made a big impact on me, not just with regard to my own recovery, but also as a professional in the addiction treatment field. The first was a line out of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, where it suggested that if you can relate to their description of the alcoholic, quote, you may be suffering from an illness that only a spiritual experience will conquer, end quote. It didn't say you're suffering from an illness that only the 12 steps will conquer, or that going to treatment will conquer, or that the right meditation will conquer. It said, only a spiritual experience will conquer. I remember thinking that was a pretty bold statement regarding the solution to alcoholism. I also remember wondering how I'd missed that before. There wasn't a lot of talk about spiritual experience in my training as a drug counselor. And we certainly didn't put a lot of focus on this in treatment at that time. The extent of the spirituality program at my first place of employment was a weekly group led by the hospital chaplain. It was called Rap with the Chap. I'm not sure there was a lot of transformation happening in that group. A second statement that really got my attention was a quote I read from an interview with Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, where he described the recovery process as ego deflation at depth followed by a spiritual experience. Let's break this down. A, ego deflation at depth feels bad. B, spiritual experience feels good. Evidently, the goal is to end up feeling good after an initial period of feeling bad. As an addiction professional, the ego deflation at depth part resonated with me in a way that sort of left a sick feeling in my gut. I immediately recognized that in the treatment world, we were really good at helping clients feel bad. We made them write lists of all their harmful consequences related to their substance use. We brought their families in to read letters to them about how much trouble they've caused. We made them wear signs that magnified negative traits they needed to change. We had all sorts of methods for making the clients feel bad. We had the ego deflation piece down. That's not to say this doesn't play an important role in treatment. It's part of the process. the dark night of the soul, the darkest hour before the dawn. In recovery, this would be the regret and the remorse one feels as they come to terms with the impact substance use has had on their life. This is the hitting bottom part of the recovery process. But the key point here, and one that I'd been missing in my experience as a treatment professional, is that dark hour is what opens the door to the spiritual experience that's supposed to come next. I saw Bill Wilson's statement as a 50-50 proposition. In other words, it appeared to me that we ought to be spending as much time, if not more, focusing on the spiritual experience part of recovery as we were on the ego deflation part. However, my observation was that we spent a heck of a lot more time on the ego deflation part and paid very little attention to the spiritual experience part. My personal experience of relapsing and having to reestablish my own recovery caused me to recognize how much this piece had been missing for me personally as well as professionally. So at that point, I decided to leave the ego deflation part for others to handle, and I would focus on doing what I could do to help others achieve this spiritual experience. I also recognized from the outset that there's no prescribed or guaranteed way of making a quote-unquote spiritual experience happen for someone. I just decided to regard it like fishing. The more time you spend with your hook in the water, the better your chances are of catching a fish. So I made it my mission when I got back to working in the field to come up with activities and material aimed at increasing clients' chances for having an experience that would inspire them to begin their own journey of personal transformation. Spirituality and recovery, a lightning rod for opinions and objections. Since we've introduced the term spiritual experience into this conversation, it's important to clarify what this means. This can be a controversial topic, and for many, it can become a deterrent to pursuing recovery. I don't like the God part of AA. If we take the time to really understand what's meant by the term spiritual and where this fits in with recovery, a lot of the common problems this topic brings up can be avoided. Spiritual does not mean religious. You don't have to join a particular religion or ascribe to a set of religious beliefs to be spiritual. My definition of spirituality: my relationship with myself and with the rest of creation. The key here is being consciously aware of the quality of these relationships. Feeling good from within. Relative to recovery, a foundational aspect of the spiritual experience is the shift from looking outside of ourselves to change how we feel to feeling good from within. The spiritual experience is transformational. More than just a good feeling that comes from within, the spiritual experience includes the power to energize, to motivate, and ultimately to transform. Something happens that inspires us to change. The spiritual experience is quote-unquote awesome. I also believe that another inherent characteristic of the spiritual experience is a feeling of awe or mystery, perhaps even a mystical experience. I believe that that's what a lot of people are looking for through drug or alcohol use. Burning bush or gradual? Sometimes we have dramatic experiences that change us in an instant. Think of Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life. I actually had some pretty dramatic events happen when I was in treatment that were perhaps on the level of quote-unquote burning bush type of experiences. See my video, The Owl, the Desert, and the Shadow. But this is also something that can happen gradually over time. We commit to a routine of personal growth and self-examination, and after a period of time, we have a growing sense of, this is pretty awesome, as we recognize how we've changed. And we realize that we really are feeling good from within. The anti-drug. As corny as that may sound, I sometimes refer to the spiritual experience, or more specifically the self-esteem that comes with it, as the anti-drug. We're much less inclined to want to change how we feel when we're already feeling awesome. Carrot or stick? There's a Native American folktale I use as a metaphor for the spiritual journey in seeing where recovery fits in with this. A key point in the story occurs when a mouse jumps up in the air and sees the sacred mountains off in the distance. At that moment, he realizes there's probably nothing more worthwhile to do in life but to go to the sacred mountains. And that begins a journey that's characterized by words like sacrifice, courage, trust, perseverance, faith, vision, fear, and ultimately, transformation. To me, that glimpse of the sacred mountains is what it's all about. The spiritual experience could be a moment that changes everything. The spark that gets us to want to go on the journey with the same dedication as the mouse in the story. That's been the intention behind my work with treatment clients for the past 30 years, to create some way for them to get a glimpse of the sacred mountains, to have some sort of experience that lights them up and makes them want to go for more. Maybe it happens for the client who has an awesome meditation experience where he feels like he's high, only on some level he realizes it's better than being high, and he ends up wanting more of that. Motivation. As I began to see the value of focusing on the spiritual experience part of Bill Wilson's recovery formula, it became clear how effective this approach is for creating motivation. I soon recognized that a carrot in front of the nose is going to be a lot more effective than a stick from behind when it comes to committing to a path of personal growth. In other words, while the ego deflation at depth has its place, the good stuff that follows is probably going to be the glue that holds this thing together. In my own experience, I was staying sober the first time around simply because I knew I had to. And that was about it, and that didn't last. This time around, everything changed when I got a glimpse of the sacred mountains and discovered what it was like to feel excited about sobriety and personal growth. Finding your inspiration. So far, I've been talking pretty much all about my work with treatment clients. And I realize that the majority of people reading this book are not necessarily going to be in treatment. Perhaps you picked this up because something about the sobriety sucks versus being excited about recovery got your attention. So I'll turn now to talking about how you can apply what we've been talking about to enrich your own recovery experience. To begin, the first thing you need to ask yourself is where your motivation is coming from. If your motivation is external, in other words, if you're staying sober for someone else or because you simply have to for some reason, the chances are slim that you're going to find any excitement or fulfillment in staying sober. To shift your motivation from external to internal, it might be helpful to examine the impact your substance use has had on your life. Make a list of benefits versus risks of continuing to use. Ask yourself where your chemical use has gotten you in various life areas, like family, social, school, job, physical, sexual, legal. That versus where do you want to be? Motivation occurs when there's a discrepancy between where a person is and where they want to be. If honest self-examination makes you feel a little uncomfortable, perhaps even remorseful, that can be a good thing. That would actually fall in the ballpark of ego deflation, which according to our formula is the requisite piece that opens the door for the spiritual experience to follow. That brings us then to the spiritual experience part. And the glaring question here is, how do you order up one of those? I'm not sure there are any guarantees in the spiritual experience department. As I said earlier, the approach I've taken is to regard it as being like fishing. The more time you spend with your hook in the water, the greater your chances are of catching a fish. That's why I've spent my career coming up with ways to increase the chances of catching a fish, or in this case, to get a glimpse of the sacred mountains, to light the spark that inspires continued growth. The thing about this is you never know when, where, or how it will happen. Some experience it through an awesome meditation experience. Some find it reading some inspirational literature. Some find it hiking in the mountains. Some find it when they survive a catastrophic event. I remember having a powerful moment sitting in what I considered to be a particularly boring peer support group one day. I looked around and the thought came to me, how awesome is this? All these people coming together in this way to all talk about the common problem of overcoming addiction and showing me that it's possible. Pretty darn cool. I left with a profoundly different attitude towards self-help groups that day. The point is, you never know when it might happen. In the next section, I'll offer some suggestions about things you can do to open yourself up to the spiritual experience and increase the chances of catching one. Tips for enriching your sobriety. I'll wrap this up with some suggestions for how you might take what we've been discussing and apply this to your own recovery journey. To begin, I first need to say that there's no definitive way to have the experience that's going to change everything for you. I've described some of the work I do that's been effective in helping clients move towards a rewarding experience in sobriety, or perhaps even having a spiritual experience. But my way is certainly not the only way. As the Chinese proverb says, many paths lead to the top of the same mountain. Therefore, rather than laying out a specific regimen for improving the quality of your recovery, I've identified what I would consider to be some of the most fruitful areas in which to concentrate your efforts. In keeping with our fishing analogy, I'm going to suggest what I would consider to be some really good fishing holes. Spend some time fishing in the following areas, and I think you'll have a good chance of catching something good. Meditation or spiritual practices. The heading above comes straight from the Andrew Weil book we talked about earlier, where it was suggested that meditation and spiritual practices are perhaps the purest way to alter our consciousness. This was part of his discussion on the fact that man has an innate tendency to want to alter consciousness. His point was that mood-altering substances are one way to accomplish this. However, meditation and spiritual practices represent a more effective way of doing this. Meditation. Meditation can be a valuable tool on a number of fronts in your effort to enhance your recovery. Develop your capacity for inner guidance, stress management and relaxation, get out of your head and into your heart. But I don't know how to meditate. It's not uncommon around recovery circles to hear people say that they struggle with meditation when the topic comes up. The one point I'll make here is that meditation doesn't have to be near as difficult as you might think. Here are a couple quick tips for getting started. Close your eyes and take 10 slow, deep breaths. Just doing that before you begin your day can make all the difference in the world as far as tuning your energy for the day. Because what really happens during that short time is we get in touch with ourselves. On the other hand, not doing something like this on a regular basis is what allows us to stay disconnected from ourselves without even realizing how disconnected we are. Read something inspirational or personal growth related, then simply think about it for a few minutes. How might I apply this to my life? What could this hold for me? Guess what? You just meditated. Ritual. Another way to develop spiritual connection is to incorporate some form of ritual or ceremony into your recovery efforts. The purpose of ceremony is to facilitate a transition. Graduation ceremonies, wedding ceremonies, funeral ceremonies. The purpose of meditation, in a sense, is to create a transition from rattled to calm, from scattered to centered, from disconnected to connected. That can happen by just closing your eyes and taking 10 slow breaths. So why not create a ceremony for this? We do this by adding an element of ritual into our activity. Ritual is what opens us up and helps us feel spiritual. You can create your own ritual by simply attaching a symbolic meaning to a particular action or event. Light a candle or burn some incense when you meditate. Watch the smoke from the incense transition from visible to invisible. Create a special place for your meditation or spiritual connection time. Include special objects that hold meaning for you. This could include a special place for your books you read for inspiration or personal growth. Self-examination. The fundamental element of recovery, or any type of spiritual growth, is the ability to look in the mirror and be honest with ourselves. Earlier, I defined spirituality as my relationship with myself as well as with the rest of creation. In this context, we see that honest self-examination is an inherent element of spiritual growth, as my relationship with myself is literally defined by how I look at myself. A program of rigorous honesty. One of the reasons I believe the 12-step program is so effective is that it's rooted in self-examination. In other words, it does a really good job of getting us to turn our focus around and keep it on ourselves. This may also be a reason some people don't like 12-step programs. A quick glance at the steps shows just how thorough they are in facilitating effective self-examination. Step 1. Am I being honest with myself about my relationship with chemicals? Steps 2 and 3. Am I running on self-will, or am I open to suggestions that might help me? Being teachable. Steps 4 through 9 are where the rubber really meets the road as far as honest self-examination. Resentments, fears, character defects, relationships, personal accountability. Steps 10 through 12 then provide a built-in process for maintaining personal accountability and continued growth. It's a pretty darn effective approach for tending to my relationship with myself as well as with the rest of creation. The spirituality of being hard on ourselves. The previous section illustrates the place of rigorous honesty involved with 12-step recovery programs. You might be thinking that all that rigorous honesty is exactly why sobriety sucks. Who wants to have to do all that negative thinking? I thought this sobriety thing was supposed to feel good. Here's where we run into a paradox with regard to honest self-examination. While facing painful truths, leveling our pride, or confronting our own character defects may be unpleasant on the surface, there goes along with it an inner sense that this is indeed a good thing to be doing. This is the kind of work that becomes the foundation of a true relationship with ourselves and in turn paves the way for the spiritual experience to unfold. Connection. I believe that addiction is about the desire for connection. That statement raises two important questions. What is it we want to connect with? Why do we have that desire? These are questions that require a longer conversation than we can go into this short ebook. For our purposes here, I'll offer some simple suggestions on how to achieve a more fulfilling recovery experience by focusing on the idea of connection. Connect with other people. There's definitely something to be said about the value of connecting with others. Here's where we see the power of peer support groups. Developing meaningful relationship with others, especially with those who are walking the same path as you, is one of the most effective things you can do to make sobriety a more enjoyable experience for you. You might be surprised at how much connection with others can impact you on a spiritual level without even realizing it. Connect with nature. For many people, spending some time outdoors can make a big difference in how you feel. Whether you're hiking on a mountaintop or sitting in your backyard looking at the trees, spending some time outside with a dedicated intention of actually experiencing nature can make a big difference in your energy. Take this a step further and combine this with a suggestion from the previous section. Try meditating outside. Sit quietly and just listen, or just look at the leaves. You might be surprised at the positive results you get from such a seemingly simple act. Connect with yourself. And that brings us to the ultimate goal here, which is the ability to connect with yourself. This is where we see how all these pools of suggestions actually flow into each other. For example, meditation. Beginning to engage in some simple meditative practices is one of the quickest and most effective ways of turning our focus inward and connecting with ourself. Self-examination. At the risk of sounding like Captain Obvious on this one, it's important to state that the path to wholeness has got to include some honest self-examination. We all have parts of ourselves that we don't like to look at. However, if I avoid looking at parts of myself, which in effect would be similar to pretending they don't exist, I'm not embracing my whole self. And if I'm not embracing my whole self, I'm moving through life in a somewhat disabled state, as it would be like dragging baggage around with me that impedes my progress. Connecting with yourself begins with knowing yourself. Look for miracles. One day when I was in early recovery, I was listening to a talk about a spiritual development program called A Course in Miracles. I remember hearing the speaker say, miracles are natural and are occurring all around you. And if you're not experiencing miracles in your life, the problem is with your own perception. I had no idea what that meant at the time. Today I can say that I do understand what that statement means, and it opens the door to one of the most valuable discussions we can have about spiritual growth. To put it as succinctly as possible for our short discussion here, all I'll say is that it's about looking rather than finding. In other words, the action of opening our eyes and looking for the miracle is how you experience the miracle. I've spent the majority of my career trying to help addiction treatment clients have some type of experience that creates a spark that inspires spiritual growth. And the easiest, most effective thing I've come up with to get this to happen is to give them one simple suggestion. Look for coincidences. It never fails. If I tell a client to pay attention to how many coincidences they experience over the next week, they always come back and excitedly report on the bizarre coincidences that have happened. It's usually with a smile on their face and with an air of incredulity. Can you believe that happened? How wild is that? In this context, I think coincidence is really just a tame way of saying miracle. The excitement, the element of mystery that accompanies a coincidence, it might seem a little silly or superficial, but I'm convinced this is one of the easiest and quickest ways to pierce the veil of wondering if there really is something out there. For a split second, it opens the door to considering the existence of a mystical realm, and for many, this can be the spark that sets the ball rolling for a full-blown spiritual experience. And it all begins with opening your eyes and looking for the miracles. Let's recap. 1. From miserable to excited. We started out with an example of a client who definitely related to the feeling of sobriety sucks in his first month or two of being sober. A few months later, he was excited and enthusiastic about his recovery. It's understandable to have a negative attitude about having to give up something we enjoy. Moving from miserable to excited about sobriety is a transformational shift. The shift begins with learning to get our good feelings from inside rather than going outside ourselves to change how we feel. 2. Ego deflation at depth followed by a spiritual experience. Bill Wilson's description of recovery illuminates the importance of recognizing a two-stage process for successful recovery. After an initial period of feeling bad, recovery is supposed to feel good. The spiritual experience often includes a sense of awe or mystery and inspires change. Spiritual doesn't necessarily mean religious. The spiritual experience may occur in a moment, or it may occur gradually over time, or both. 3. Inspiration. After beginning to focus on the spiritual experience part that's supposed to follow the ego deflation at depth, I realized that experiencing something good related to recovery was more effective in creating motivation than feeling bad. Internal motivation versus external motivation. If you're staying sober because you have to, the chances are slim that you're going to find any excitement or fulfillment in staying sober. A glimpse of the sacred mountains. The spark that inspires us to begin a journey that leads to personal transformation. 4. Tips for enriching your recovery. There's no guaranteed way of having a spiritual experience. Approach it like fishing. The more time you keep your hook in the water, the better the chances are of catching one. 4 pools to keep your hook in: meditation and spiritual practices, self-examination, connection, and look for miracles.